they had trouble with that. So what did they do instead? They called his complaint line. They weren't satisfied with this Exodus product that they'd been given. They weren't happy with it. They led to their doubts, consumed. So how does Moses respond? How does Moses react? He's frustrated. These people are going to kill me. He turns to God and he says, what am I going to do? God gives him a vision, sends him out with the elders, takes his staff, touches a rock, and water pours forth as the people have been complaining about thirst. And God produces water. This is a miracle. God provides for his people. Isn't this wonderful? And the people, acting like the good consumers they were, happily drank. In the story, everything's nice, right? But that's not the point of this story. This story of the Exodus journey is not about how God provides and all you have to do is trust in God and God will give you water in the desert. The point of this story is not that God provides, but that the people didn't. It was the Israelites' lack of faith that is the core point of this story. When Moses names the place, he doesn't name this, this is the place of God's water miracle and how he provided it. He names the place Massa and Meribah. Those words do not mean miracle, and they do not mean water. What they mean is, respectively, tested, as in, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test, and quarried. This was a place where the Israelites showed that they didn't get why God was leading to the promised land. It's not a happy story. That water given was only dragged out of God by a people who would not trust that if they just walked another 4 or 5 days, there would be something further. They wouldn't have that trust. They had to drink right now. We hear more about water this morning in the exchange between the Samaritan woman and Jesus in the Gospel of John. It's an unusual exchange. Jesus is from Judah. He is a Judeo, which is the word for Jews in John. It's a very specific word. It means people who live in the southern kingdom. She was a Samaritan. She lived in the northern kingdom, and the people in the south just hated the people in the north. It was an old family squabble. So Jesus was supposed to hate her, but he talked to her. She was surprised. You're even talking to me? I mean, yeah, you asked me for a drink. You're speaking to me. And Jesus tells her, after they have sort of an opening icebreaker conversation about getting him a glass of water, tells her about living water, which can be water that is not dank, is not stagnant, it's not sitting in a pool with a crust of algae on it. Living water is water that flows, that burbles, that moves, that is alive in its movement. And Jesus is, of course, not talking about H2O. He's not talking about the substance. And the woman only partially understands that. When he talks about that thing that refreshes and renews, that gives life, that fulfills a need that all creatures have, he's not talking about water. He's talking about himself and the Spirit of God that fills him. He's talking about the new life that he both lives and breathes. And if we read further on in the story, what do we hear? What effect does this conversation have? The woman goes back and talks to her Samaritan brethren, and they respond. It plants a seed. And if we read all of John, keep on going through his story, we have to understand this as part of what Jesus is trying to do. It's part of the whole story, trying to bring about life. And not just that, trying to give that same Spirit, that same living water that he held within himself to all of those around him. Living water, not just as something that you take in for yourself, not just something that you consume so you won't ever have to be thirsty again. It's something that you take in and you give back. And if you have even the tiniest flicker of the Spirit Jesus promised us, you know that we are also supposed, in our own way, to produce, to pour forth, to give out. Our lives, if they are lives in Christ, cannot be entirely inward, with the self-serving focus of consumption. They have to be turned outward, towards those around us. But how do we do that? How do we shift from being driven by our very, very human desire to be served and turn instead to living as a servant? How do we stop seeking to slake our own thirst and instead turn to ending the thirst of others? Again, we go back to John's Gospel, because the Gospel of John is unique among the Gospels, in that it shows us a Jesus whose teachings are of a different type than the Jesus we hear of in Matthew and Mark and Luke. Those show us Jesus' public ministry, as he went out, as he taught, as he preached, as he stood up on the mountain and told people what they needed to do, as he walked through Jerusalem and told them what they needed. How well did those people hear? Did they understand? Oh, they got excited about it, sure. But did they understand? Some of them did. But most of them didn't. It was those people who turned and shouted and called for his blood. Because they had to find